A worker bee that emerges from her cell today will not become a forager for approximately 21 days. During those 3 weeks, she will nurse larvae, produce wax, receive and process incoming nectar, regulate hive temperature, and guard the entrance. Every task the hive requires except the one that generates surplus honey. The forager population in your colony right now is not the bees you see covering the frames today. It is the bees that were eggs 3 weeks ago. And the forager population that will be present when your primary nectar flow peaks, the population that determines how much honey actually gets stored, is the brood that exists in your hive right now, developing on a biological clock you cannot speed up and cannot pause. This is the pipeline that determines honey production, and it is almost never discussed in those terms. The conversation about honey yield focuses on population size, on super timing, on forage availability. It rarely focuses on the ratio of bees actually producing honey to bees doing everything else, a ratio that can be dramatically unfavorable in a colony that looks, from the outside, exactly like a high-performing unit. The most consistent commercial honey producers of the 1880s and 1890s understood this ratio as the central variable of their spring management. They could not change the biology of the 21-day pipeline, but they could and did manage the brood nest deliberately to ensure that the pipeline delivered its forager cohort at the precise moment the nectar flow arrived, rather than 3 weeks before it or 3 weeks after. The biological mechanism behind the 21-day transition is worth understanding precisely because it reveals why the forager ratio matters more than raw population size. When a worker bee emerges, her hypopharyngeal glands, the paired secretory structures in her head that produce royal jelly and brood food, are undeveloped. Over her first week of adult life, those glands develop to full capacity, and she begins her nurse bee career, feeding larvae, attending the queen, producing the protein-rich secretions that sustain brood development. This is the phase of maximum metabolic investment in the colony's future population. Then, at around day 18 to 21, a fundamental physiological shift occurs. The hypopharyngeal glands begin to regress. Their secretory function changes from brood food production to nectar enzyme production, specifically the invertase and glucose oxidase that convert incoming nectar into honey. The bee's thorax muscles strengthen for sustained flight. Her orientation flights begin. She crosses irreversibly from house bee to forager. What this means in practice is that the colony's productive capacity at any given moment is not a function of how many bees are present. It is a function of where those bees are in this 21-day developmental arc. A colony with 60,000 bees, most of them in their first 10 days of adult life, has a very different honey-producing capacity than a colony of 40,000 bees whose demographic weight sits at days 18 to 25. Population size and productive capacity are not the same measurement. The 1880s commercial producers who understood this distinction consistently outperformed those who did not. The practical consequence of this biology, the part that most beekeepers have never been explicitly shown, is that a colony at peak spring population is simultaneously at its least efficient honey-producing configuration. Peak population occurs when the queen has been laying at maximum rate for several weeks, and the brood nest is operating at full capacity. At that moment, the largest demographic cohort in the colony is nurse bees, young workers in their first 2 weeks of adult life, their hypopharyngeal glands fully developed and running at maximum output, feeding the density of larvae that peak brood production requires. Foragers, bees past the 21-day transition, represent a smaller proportional share of the adult population than they will at any subsequent point, precisely because the rate of brood emergence has been so high for so long. The colony looks strongest. Its productive ratio is at a seasonal low, and if the primary nectar flow arrives in this window, which it frequently does because spring population peaks and spring bloom peaks are driven by the same warming seasonal calendar, the colony enters the flow with its largest ever workforce and its lowest forager-to-nurse ratio of the year. That misalignment between population peak and productive ratio peak is the mechanism behind the pattern that puzzled commercial producers in the 1880s. Colonies that had wintered strongest and built fastest sometimes produced less surplus honey than mid-strength colonies in the same forage zone, whose demographic curve happened to align more favorably with the flow. The historical producers who first documented this pattern in the American Bee Journal exchanges of the 1880s and 1890s did not have the vocabulary of hypopharyngeal gland regression or age polyethism. What they had was systematic outcome comparison across multiple colonies in the same apiary, season after season, with the economic incentive to understand why results diverged between units that appeared equivalent. The pattern they described was specific. Colonies that had expanded most rapidly in early spring, the ones with the densest brood nests and the most bees on the frames by mid-April, were not reliably the highest honey producers when the primary flow arrived in May. The colonies that peaked slightly later, or that had been managed to produce a forager cohort maturing in the 2 weeks immediately preceding the flow, outperformed the earlier building colonies with measurable consistency in years when the flow window was narrow. Their explanation was framed in the language of timing rather than demographics. They said the productive colony was one that was up for the flow, a phrase that meant something more precise than simply being strong. It meant having the right bees, older bees, forager age bees, active at the moment the nectar was available. Getting the colony up for the flow was not a passive outcome of general spring management. It was the result of deliberate decisions about the brood nest made in the weeks before the flow arrived. And the producers who made those decisions correctly, season after season, are the ones whose letters to the American Bee Journal show the yield differentials that puzzled their neighbors. Here's where the biology makes the management logic explicit in a way that the historical producers observed empirically, but could not fully explain. The primary nectar flow in most temperate North American apiaries lasts between 10 and 21 days. Within that window, the forager population the colony deploys each morning, and the speed at which those foragers cycle between the field and the honey storage cells determines the volume of nectar converted into capped surplus. A forager bee makes between 7 and 12 collection flights per day during a strong flow, depending on the distance to the forage source and the efficiency of nectar handoff to house bees upon return. That handoff efficiency, how quickly a returning forager can unload her nectar crop to a house bee receiver and depart again, is sensitive to receiver availability. In a colony whose house bee population is heavily weighted toward young nurse bees occupied with larvae, the handoff queue is long. Forager cycle time extends. The same bee makes fewer flights per day. Across a 10-day flow, this forager cycle friction accumulates into a measurable reduction in stored honey. Not because the foragers are weak, not because the forage is scarce, but because the internal colony economy is congested with brood care demand at the precise moment it should be maximally committed to nectar processing. The productive ratio problem shows up not just in how many foragers are present, but in how efficiently each forager can operate within the colony's internal processing system. The management intervention that the most productive 1880s commercial operations used to align the demographic pipeline with the nectar flow was not supering. It was not adding bees. It was a specific and deliberate manipulation of the brood nest in the 3 to 4 weeks before the anticipated flow peak, timed to produce a forager surge at the correct moment by managing what was being raised in the brood nest at the correct moment before that. The practice had two components. The first was what they called brood nest balance, ensuring that the central brood frames in the 3 to 4 weeks before the flow were predominantly capped rather than open, so that the bees emerging from those frames would complete their 21-day house bee development and cross the forager threshold during the flow itself, rather than before or after it. Open brood in the brood nest 4 weeks before the flow produces bees who emerge 3 weeks before the flow, spend 3 weeks as house bees, and begin foraging at the exact moment the flow ends. Capped brood in the brood nest 3 weeks before the flow produces bees who emerge 2 weeks before the flow, spend 3 weeks as house bees, and are forager ready at the flow's peak. The timing of what is in the brood nest at the pre-flow management window determines the demographic composition of the colony at the moment the nectar arrives. The second component was removing sealed brood from colonies that were demographically heavy in house bees, with the same capped brood frame removal described in the pre-flow split protocol, timing that removal to the window where it would advance the forager ratio rather than simply reduce total population. The most consequential error that undermines honey production in well-managed spring colonies is conflating population size with productive capacity and responding to light supers or below expectation yields by adding bees to the equation. Through package additions, through combining colonies, through any input that increases raw population, without addressing the demographic ratio that determines what that population actually does. A colony of 60,000 bees where 40,000 are nurse bees does not need more bees. It needs its existing bees to be older, and no management action can make a nurse bee older faster. The 21-day developmental arc is fixed. What can be managed is the timing of what was raised, so that the bees who are 21 days old when the flow arrives are numerous, and the bees who are 7 days old when the flow arrives are fewer. This is a retrospective management problem. The decisions that determine it were made 3 weeks ago, not today. A beekeeper who opens a hive on the first day of the flow and finds lighter supers than expected cannot fix the forager ratio that morning. He can add a super, he can add drawn comb. Neither action changes the demographic composition of the colony. The forager population for the next 10 days was determined by the brood nest management of the previous 3 weeks. What he can fix today is the brood nest for the next flow, which means the relevant management action at the start of one flow is not what goes above the colony, but what is in the brood nest below it, and what it will produce in 3 weeks' time. There is a second dimension of the productive ratio that operates at the super level rather than the brood nest level, and it connects directly to the forager cycle time problem. When a forager returns to the hive with a full nectar crop, she transfers it to a house bee receiver in a trophylactic exchange that takes 30 seconds to several minutes, depending on receiver availability. The receiver then moves the nectar to a storage cell, fans it to begin evaporation, and makes herself available for the next handoff. If the hive is congested, if the super above the brood nest is approaching capacity, if the house bees are simultaneously managing a large open brood population, if the internal circulation is crowded, the handoff queue lengthens and forager redeparture is delayed. The old rule of thumb from early 20th century American commercial beekeeping, add a super when 1/3 to 1/2 of the current super is capped, was not arbitrary. It was calibrated to maintain the internal circulation that keeps forager cycle time short. A super added after the existing one is full recreates the spatial congestion that drives the swarm impulse, slows the handoff queue, and extends forager cycle time precisely when cycle time should be at its seasonal minimum. A super added at 1/3 capacity keeps the house bee receiver population ahead of the forager return rate, eliminates the handoff bottleneck, and allows each forager to complete more collection flights per day across the flow window. The same foraging force, the same forage, the same number of days, and a measurably different honey yield, determined entirely by whether the super was added before the congestion point or after it. The specific inspection practice that gives a beekeeper the information they need to project their colony's demographic state 3 weeks forward requires one additional question added to the standard spring inspection. After assessing the brood pattern and confirming the queen's activity, the beekeeper examines the ratio of open to capped brood across the central frames. Not the total quantity of brood, which is what most spring inspections assess, but the developmental stage distribution. A brood nest that is predominantly open larvae represents a pipeline that will produce its forager cohort in 5 to 6 weeks. A brood nest that is predominantly capped represents a pipeline that will produce foragers in 3 weeks. The difference between these two configurations at the moment of spring inspection is a 2 to 3 week difference in when the colony will reach its forager peak. A beekeeper who knows when their primary nectar flow typically peaks can calculate backward to identify which brood nest configuration will produce forager peak alignment, and can assess at the spring inspection whether their current colony is on the correct or incorrect trajectory. This is the inspection question the 1880s commercial producers were asking. Not, is the colony healthy? Which is answered by the brood pattern's uniformity and the queen's active presence. But when will this colony's forager peak arrive relative to my bloom calendar, which is answered by the developmental stage distribution of the brood it is currently raising, read as a 3-week population projection rather than a current health snapshot. The practical implication of this demographic reading is not that beekeepers should manipulate brood nest composition artificially on every inspection. It is that the timing of the interventions already performed, splits, brood removal, comb rotation, swarm management, determines the demographic outcome at the flow, and those interventions should be timed with that outcome in mind, rather than as reactive responses to visible symptoms. A pre-flow split performed at the correct 10-day window does not just relieve swarm pressure. It simultaneously advances the forager ratio in the parent colony by removing the capped brood representing the future nursing obligation and triggering the accelerated nurse-to-forager transition in the queenless environment. The demographic benefit and the production benefit are the same mechanism. A comb rotation performed in April that replaces old compressed cells with clean drawn comb at the brood center does not just reduce pathogen loading. It provides the queen with a clean expansion zone filled with new brood on a schedule that, if correctly timed, will produce a forager cohort at the flow peak. Every spring management decision has a demographic consequence 3 weeks forward. The 1880s commercial producers who consistently outperformed their neighbors were not performing more interventions. They were timing their interventions with the forager pipeline in mind as the primary variable rather than treating each intervention as an independent response to a separate, visible problem. What the historical record of American commercial beekeeping most clearly shows about the productive ratio is not a single technique, but a management orientation. The habit of reading the brood nest as a population projection rather than a current state. The producers who filled the heaviest honey houses each season, documented in the American Bee Journal exchanges of the 1880s through the early 1900s as reliable outliers in their regional yield data, consistently described their spring management in terms of what the colony would be doing in 3 weeks, not what it was doing today. They described checking whether the current brood nest distribution would bring enough foragers to the flow. They described making their splits not when the colony showed swarm signs, but when the brood-to-nurse ratio indicated that the post-split demographic would align the parent colony's forager peak with the bloom calendar. They described adding supers not when the existing super was full, but when the internal circulation dynamics indicated that the handoff queue was beginning to lengthen. None of this required instruments or laboratory analysis. It required reading the brood nest as a temporal document, understanding that the cells in front of them contained a 3-week projection of the colony's productive capacity, not just a snapshot of its current health. That reading habit, once developed, produces a fundamentally different set of management decisions than the reactive inspection protocol that most modern beekeeping instruction teaches. The decisions look similar from the outside. Their timing and their biological logic are entirely different. There is a direct and specific action available to every beekeeper right now, in the last days of April, that addresses the forager ratio problem for the approaching flow. Pull the 2 or 3 central brood frames from your strongest colony and read their developmental stage distribution. If the majority of brood cells are capped, pupae in the last 10 to 12 days before emergence, those bees will emerge within 2 weeks, begin their house bee duties, and reach forager age approximately 5 weeks from now. Depending on your local flow timing, that may be early, late, or aligned. If the majority of brood cells are open larvae, first through 8th day of development, those bees are 5 to 6 weeks from forager status. For most temperate North American beekeepers with a May or early June primary flow peak, open larval heavy brood nests in late April represent a demographic pipeline that will deliver its forager cohort 1 to 2 weeks after the flow ends. That is the configuration that produces strong colonies with light supers. The correction is not dramatic. It is the drawn comb insertion described in the pre-swarm and pre-flow split videos. Moving capped brood frames to the periphery, inserting clean drawn comb at the center to encourage the queen to lay a new cohort on a more favorable schedule, and reading the result at the next inspection to confirm the trajectory has shifted. 1 inspection, 1 frame insertion, and a 3-week wait to see the forager cohort that results. This is the management action the flow is already asking for. The bees that will determine your honey yield this season are in your hive right now, at some point in their 21-day developmental arc, moving toward a forager state that either will or will not align with the window when your local nectar sources are at peak production. That alignment was not determined this morning. It was set by every brood nest decision you made in the last 3 weeks. The splits you performed or did not perform, the comb you rotated or did not rotate, the swarm pressure you relieved or allowed to build. What the 1880s commercial producers understood, and what the hypopharyngeal gland research published a century later confirmed, is that the colony's honey production is a demographic output, not a behavioral one. You cannot ask the bees to produce more honey. You can only ensure that the bees present at the critical moment are the right age. The window to influence the flow you are about to experience is still partially open. The brood nest is readable. The pipeline is projectable, and the interventions that shift it, drawn comb insertion, capped brood timing, the pre-flow split, all work on the same 21-day biological clock that has governed honeybee development since long before the first managed hive. Leave a comment below with what your brood nest looks like right now, predominantly open or predominantly capped, and when your primary flow typically peaks. And subscribe if this kind of biology first, historically grounded beekeeping is what you came here for.